Hi, I'm Stacy Clark, and welcome to Legal Talk. Today we have another exciting program aimed to bring you, your family, and your business some very important information. My guest today is Steve Barrett. Steve is co-chair of the litigation department of one of the area's most prominent law firms, Hamburg, Rubin, Mullen, Maxwell, and Lupin. Steve, why don't you tell us about your practice, and then we'll get into what you're going to be talking about today. How do you help people?
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you for having me for this opportunity to speak to the public and our audience members. I'm with a firm in Bluebell, as you already gave the name, and for 30 years I've been doing major commercial transactional litigation, but for the last 20 years in particular, I have been on essentially very catastrophic cases such as wrongful death as a result of either professional negligence or, as we'll be talking about in a few moments, defects in drugs or devices, medical devices that have harmed the public. So my goal here today is to talk about a couple items which I think you're going to prompt me about, to give a lot of education, a lot of information, things that societally are very important that the public should have more background information about and action steps they can take if their need arises.
Okay, that's great. So what kinds of injuries do you want to discuss today for which our viewers may be entitled to some kind of compensation if they have been harmed?
Okay, so very acutely, very on topic today, meaning as of today and for the last 6 to 8 weeks, there are two things which I think the public has some information about, but I'd like to provide more information and education. One is the COVID-19 and the pandemic and the era we're living in with the coronavirus. And the second one is a very recent recall by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, of a very, very common heartburn medication known as Zantac.
Right.
We've seen commercials, and over the years we've seen commercials and ads, but that drug, for reasons we'll discuss in a few moments, has been recalled because of a danger that it poses in causing cancer.
Okay. So why don't we start with COVID-19? What's going on there in terms of from a personal injury standpoint? Why is this of interest to you?
Well, when you have serious, experienced personal injury attorneys, we don't look necessarily to find opportunity wherever it may be. Those of us like myself and my firm who've been doing this long and hard, we do a lot of investigation, a lot of research, and we try and find out what's going on in the public that we can really be of service to people who are harmed. So these aren't things that are frivolous or things that are just sort of fly-by-night issues or incidents. These are very weighty, compelling things that really, with the help of lawyers, can actually influence policy and influence change in the healthcare delivery system. So what I wanted to talk about today for our audience members is when it comes to COVID-19, we've all been living, you don't need to hear from me to obviously explain some of the stressors and really the distress it's caused on the world, let alone our community here in the main line. Mm-hmm. But one thing that has come to fruition, which was something I was suspecting of when this first broke, and I have statistics to share with the audience members which bear this out, are nursing home and extended care home facilities. Even before the pandemic, nursing homes and personal care homes always housed and was to provide some place to live and give relief to our loved ones who aren't independent anymore, whether it's cognitive issues with dementia or Alzheimer's, or physical debilitating issues. We make heart-wrenching decisions to put loved ones in these facilities because that's where we believe and trust and hope they're going to get the best care. Mm-hmm. Because we can't do it as children or as grandchildren. We're not equipped. We're not skilled. So it's always been a societal issue that goes beyond law and has nothing to do with the law necessarily.
Right.
Well, we found out with the pandemic, and of all the experts we've heard from, whether it's Dr. Fauci from the NIH or Dr. Birx at the federal level and our own state healthcare officials, particularly the chair of the Montgomery County Commissioners, Dr. Arkush, she's been tracking that when it comes to nursing home and extended care nursing homes, I have statistics which I think are pretty alarming and pretty astonishing. In Pennsylvania, at least Montgomery County commissioners, and Dr. Arkush started this, and now the state, when you go on their website, tracks this. There have been to date, today's April 24th when we are taping this, if you will. We're having our interview for this. This. There have been to date, and let me just look down my pad, 1,421 deaths, COVID-19 related deaths in Pennsylvania. Stacey, I'd like you to take a guess. Out of the 1,421 deaths as of today, how many of those deaths are related or occurred in a nursing home extended care facility by percentage? Do you have any idea, and can you take even a wildest guess as to how many of all those deaths occurred just in nursing homes?
Wow, well, I have been keeping track of this. I have been reading the papers, so I'm going to say half.
You are absolutely right, and a little bit north of half. As of today, 849 of those 1,421 deaths have occurred in nursing homes or extended care facilities. Now, why is that, as an attorney, such as myself, what am I looking into and saying to myself? Well, I know that there have been guidelines through the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and through our own state health department, which has been doing a fabulous job in providing information, being transparent, and providing guidelines, okay? For weeks now, 8, 10, perhaps 12 weeks, they have been guidelines. These facilities are essentially quasi-medical. They have directors of nursing, they have medical directors, they have LPNs. This is not simply a retirement home where people are otherwise independent. These people are our most vulnerable. These are the loved ones that we want to make sure are given proper care and attention.
For sure.
So when I saw these figures and statistics, what jumped out at me, given the fact that there's been long-standing protocols in place to protect our most vulnerable, is borne out by these unfortunate death rates. They're the ones that are going to get hit the most. They're the ones that are at risk for losing their lives. The question arises whether these facilities are following the protocols. Are they doing the things they are supposed to be doing? And I'll restate that one more time. Are these facilities that are housing and caring for our loved ones doing the things that they are supposed to be doing? Because we ourselves can't be there. We can't be their advocates because obviously of social distancing. We can't have the access to them as much during this pandemic because we don't want to cross-contaminate and bring perhaps an asymptomatic loved one back home where they now contaminate their loved ones. So there have been more blockades to get to our loved ones. So the greater need to make sure that these facilities are doing what, again, they're supposed to be doing according to these standards and protocols. And the concern is, as a lawyer, is that how many, if any, of these deaths could have been avoided? How many of these deaths, essentially, if the facility had been doing its job, could have been avoided where we still have our loved one? We still have our grandmother. We can take our grandchildren to once this is over and spend weekends or go during the week. How many of these were avoidable? And that's the operative word, avoidable.
So are you saying that there are protocols that have been issued by the state and the federal government that nursing homes and skilled nursing facilities have to abide by, that they have a reasonable duty of care, plus they now have to adhere to these protocols? And if you can show that the protocols have not been followed and a loved one has died or contracted the disease, that can be actionable perhaps?
Yes, a lawsuit would be based on not just whether they have a duty, but more importantly, the state itself, the Department of Health, regulates these facilities, meaning they exert control and power all the time over these facilities. If there is a problem, if internally you have a whistleblower, a nurse that sees that something is going awry, or a loved one feels that their grandparent or their parent has not been treated properly, the Department of Health for Pennsylvania under pa.gov has an actual whole page and website where you can have a complaint filed right online. They actually have a form. There's an emergency number. They wanted this information because they know, tragically, abuses and neglect occur at these facilities that are mostly corporately owned, and usually the corporations are regional or national, okay? They have many of these all over the place. So you get essentially sort of cookie cutter in terms of protocols and policies, and a lot essentially falls through the gaps. So yes, not only is there a duty to follow these guidelines, there's actually a legal charge that they must follow these guidelines. And if they don't, not only is there a civil action, meaning coming to a lawyer like me and bringing an action and finding out and investigating, but the state itself is armed with agents who go once they are tipped off, once they're notified of a complaint or an issue or problem that has led to harm, that has led to a death. They can go in and do their own investigation. They write up a report, and they can actually cite these facilities for violations. And God forbid, if it rises to the level of criminality, they can refer it over to the criminal arm of the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania. So yes, there are not only duties that just by way of common law, meaning principles that have been longstanding, but these facilities have an affirmative, almost above and beyond obligation because they must abide by and follow the guidelines as issued by the state and even the federal government.
Okay, and as I recall from viewing some of these, it has to do with not allowing sick workers to come in, protocols in terms of physical distancing, wearing the proper protective gear, having sanitary conditions. Those might be some of the protocols that were not followed.
Right. You've hit many of the topics in this particular acute issue when it comes to COVID-19, which is these healthcare workers, and I'll call them healthcare workers because that's what they're doing. They're essentially extending themselves and helping the welfare, both physical, mental, and social for our loved ones in these facilities. They have to abide, not just individually, to do the right thing, wearing the right protective equipment, making sure that they sanitize not only themselves, but the gloves, their masks, their gown, have to dispose of these properly. These also fall into protocols and policies that have to be essentially implemented, and they have to be make sure they're enforced by the nursing home. Okay, it's not just the individual responsibility, which is important, and if that's breached, that is also actionable, meaning a lawsuit can be brought, but also the facility itself has to comply and enforce and ensure that these protocols are being kept in place. Meaning, if there is not a policy, if there is not something that the nursing home actually issues that says you must dispose of contaminated patient devices or thermometer covers or whatever you may want to call it, and they don't have a protocol, and therefore the facility overall is not handling this contaminated material properly, then the institution itself is responsible and liable for harm that's suffered. So it's both an individual caregiver level and a facility institutional level.
Okay, well, let's turn to your second topic because I know it's very important for anyone who's ever taken Zantac. Tell us about the recall, why this over-the-counter heartburn medicine was recalled, and what the ramifications of the recall mean for folks, again, in our audience who may have taken Zantac over a period of time or who have loved ones who have experienced some sort of cancers that are now proven to be related to this drug.
Okay, so yes, and the reason why this topic is timely is because the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, as of April 1, officially recalled Zantac, whether it was prescription or whether it was over the counter. Again, I think most of our viewers know what Zantac is. By commercials, past commercials that was, brochures, advertising, just having sort of an end cap aisle at CVS or Rite Aid, and they have all the antacids and heartburn medication. So I don't think I need to go into necessarily what Zantac is. But what the audience has to know is that Zantac has been around since the early 1980s. It was manufactured and produced by a local but yet international drug company, GlaxoSmithKline, Glaxo. So it turns out one of the basis, if not the basis for the recall, is that Zantac and its generic chemical name is ranitidine. Okay, that's the generic name for Zantac, ranitidine. It has been manufactured from day one with a cancer-causing agent, but from day one, it was a known cancer-causing agent or element as part of the drug. And it turns out that the rival companies, the rival manufacturers of Zantac, as of right now, it is not implicated, meaning this cancer-causing element is not apparently, as of right now, and the FDA is still doing studies, but it seems like the peptides, if you will, and the taganettes and so forth, they do not have this one particular element that Zantac, as of today,
Prilosec, yeah.
Prilosec. Okay. This is called, okay, I'm going to give you the acronym first. The cancer-causing agent, the acronym is NDMA. NDMA. And that is short for nitrosodimethylamine. Okay, it's a mouthful. That's why it's easier. NDMA. Okay. So a little quick history about NDMA, which we've been finding and learning through our investigation. NDMA was used in the rocket fuel manufacturing in the early 1900s. So when rocket fuel was manufactured, they found this NDMA. It had other commercial purposes throughout the 20th century, but then as of, let's say, 30 or 40 years ago, approximately, it really only had one use. What was that use? It's so ironic as of the recall for the cancer-causing agent. I don't want to say it's humorous, but it takes your breath away. The one use that had been used for, its actual use as a separate component, was to induce cancer in animals so that scientists and doctors could then do studies on the cancer with other drugs and treatments. So essentially, when you're in a laboratory, they would pump up these animals with NDMA to create cancer tumors, so then they can study the tumor along with other possible cancer treatments. Well, that particular element was in and has been in Zantac, which fortunately has been recalled. And what we're finding is, through, again, the scientific community and a number of studies, they're finding that long-term users of Zantac have developed and will develop and are developing cancers in the stomach, the colon, the prostate, the bladder, and even other cancers, believe it or not, are implicated with this NDMA component of Zantac.
I think blood cancers as well, right?
There can be blood cancers, but there are limiting circumstances. So it is implicated with blood cancers, but there have to be a certain number of factors at play to rule it in as a contributing factor to that type of cancer.
Okay, so has litigation started against the manufacturers of Zantac? What do people need to know?
Yes, we've already prepared several complaints on behalf of clients. And there's going to be what's called, very briefly, it's called MDL, another acronym. Unfortunately, I'm throwing out a lot of acronyms. Acronyms in the MDL in the legal community is called multi-district litigation. There are not many attorneys that practice multi-district litigation. Nationwide, there are a number of them, but it's not as though it's going to be a common type of practice for your average personal injury attorney. It's complex, it's in federal court, and essentially what an MDL does, so your viewers understand, I've explained this countless times to many clients in other MDLs in the past that I've been involved with. An MDL is not a class action, although it sort of operates like one. Big companies like Glaxo, right? If they're going to have thousands of lawsuits across the country, and therefore the same discovery, the same amount of depositions, that company is going to go and file for bankruptcy protection, because you can't sustain economically a company and its viability if you're going to have thousands of concurrent lawsuits going on where their CEO is going to be deposed 3,000 times in 3 separate cases. So what the MDL does, it consolidates all the cases where each lawyer has and retains their own case, but there is a common process for depositions, written discovery, meaning getting records from the manufacturer like Glaxo. So it consolidates it for efficiency purposes, okay? And therefore, ultimately what happens is there are attorneys that do a lot of the work, both for the defense, meaning for the company, and for the plaintiffs. And then at the end of the day, if it's a successful MDL on behalf of the plaintiffs and the victims, there's usually a very large global settlement agreement. This is if it's successful, because not all MDLs are successful in the end for plaintiffs. But in this case, I could tell you that in those MDLs, multi-district litigations, where there's been an actual recall by the FDA, the chances of a successful outcome are much greater. And by quick example, if I have a moment, there was very large MDL litigation with hip implants from the same company. One was recalled and another version of it was not recalled. Well, there was an MDL for the recalled version of the hip, and that settled successfully. And a lot of the victims who had to get revisions to their hip implants got meaningful settlements and outcomes. The other one, though, from the same company that didn't have an actual recall, did not end up so well. So when I see that the FDA has recalled the Zantac, that gives people who have suffered cancers or their loved ones, they should seek out the advice of an attorney completely with the help of their medical support, their doctors, their primary care physicians. If they think there's anything that is different or strange, or even they develop a cancer that they believe can be related because they have been or their loved one has been a long-term Zantac user, they should get this checked out and monitored and gets also a medical input or opinion on that as well, because that will also help in treatment perhaps. Okay. And real quick, Stacy, if I may, I just had a war story. The medical community, I want to sort of inform our viewers, the medical community is very in tune with Zantac. I had a recent client who we signed up. Unfortunately, this gentleman's developed prostate cancer. He was on Zantac for many, many, many years. And even when he got to his oncologist for treatment for the prostate cancer, he told me, and this is anecdotal, meaning this is what my client told me. He said that his oncologist, when he got the history and he knew that there was Zantac in his history, he told him to stop taking the Zantac. And this was just before the recall, by the way. This wasn't even when the recall occurred. His doctor told him about 3 or 4 months ago, before the recall occurred, stop taking the Zantac and switch to Pepcid. To me, that's telling me and informing me that the medical providers out there are in tune, are familiar, and have an understanding about the unfortunate implications of Zantac and its cancer-causing propensity or its cancer-causing possibility. Where this anecdotal comment by my client, even his oncologist told him to get off the Zantac and switch to Pepcid for his heartburn.
For the recall. Yeah. And I think you told me that many people who are presenting with these kinds of cancers had no other risk factors.
Correct. That's another sort of criteria that we look to. Again, as I told you about the COVID-19, we need to do our investigation and we have to have our material to really be solid that is there an actual cause of action or is there liability on behalf of the nursing home. We just don't throw things up against the wind as responsible attorneys. Same thing with these. When it comes to your question, we also want to be diligent in what we do. And therefore, one of the criteria we're learning from the scientific community, just like, when it comes to when do we reopen the states for business, we should listen to our health experts. Same thing when it comes to the law in many respects, okay? What the medical scientific community is, through its studies of this NDMA and its cancer-causing properties, not only do you have to be a long-term user, 4, 6, 10 years of regular use of Zantac or longer, you also have to have certain criteria, because if, for example, you actually have a history of, in the family, genetically you're predisposed, okay, that can be a component that essentially rules out a possible case, okay? So other risk factors, such as when it comes to bladder cancer, it's well known for years, decades now, that if you were a substantial smoker, even if you stopped for 20, 30 years, but in your youth, for let's say 10, 15 years you smoked, from let's say age 18 to 35 and you stopped, and age 60 or 65 you develop bladder cancer, well, that is a known risk factor in developing bladder cancer. So most of my clients that we sign up do not have the typical common risk factors in developing the cancer. In many of these cases, once now we found out about Zantac and NDMA, it turns out that the real risk factor, and perhaps the only risk factor, was the taking of the Zantac for such a long period of time.
Interesting. So to conclude today, why don't you give us 2 takeaways for the audience, one for COVID-19 and one for Zantac? What do you want people to know?
I first want them to be educated. Okay, that's the most important thing, because with education and being informed, it puts everybody, I should say, in a better position to do what's right for themselves and safeguard their own health and the health of their loved ones. However, with hopefully a little bit of information, education I provided to those that are listening, and they pass it along to friends and loved ones. In either situation, if you think now that I've given you the context and the parameters that there is something that has gone awry, that something could have been avoided, whether it is contracting COVID-19 that led to a loved one's death, or whether it's a development of a cancer that now, based on, again, on the history of Zantac use, may be related to that Zantac use. Not only do you go to your health officials, whether it's in the state for COVID-19, Department of Health, or whether it's with your own medical doctor, you should also go to an experienced personal injury attorney who can also navigate the civil end in trying to address any harm that somebody has suffered, whether it's yourself or whether it's a loved one.
And I think we're showing the audience right now some contact information for you. sbarrett@hrmml.com. And your firm's website is www.hrmml.com as well, if people have more questions about either of these topics. Now, we didn't have time to get to some other topics that I know you're very familiar with, including lawsuits that have risen against the clergy, against the Boy Scouts, and other places that should have had a duty of care to take care of people who later were found to have been abused. So hopefully we'll get to talk to you about that at some later date. I want to thank everyone for watching today. Steve, thanks for being my guest. And until next time, it's been Legal Talk with Stacy Clark.